So I was thinking a lot uh, about like past situations because like the inner child and the inner teenager is just like resurfacing with their own information that they want to put out. And so I was thinking about how like it was about fear. Like that's what I was focusing on, like thinking about, and about how like most of my fear came from. I need a fidget toy because I use cards as fidget toys, and I think that makes too much noise. Anyways, most of my fear growing up came from outside sources, came from other places, and like became internalized. Because I have a previous video where I mentioned like I became afraid of like supernatural things from um, being in the house when like we were in somebody else's house and my family was doing an exorcism of whatever the fuck was in the house, and all I know is I felt the terror, the sheer terror of one of the people in the house, and I pretty much internalized that and kept that forever for a long time as my own terror. But I was always interested in things like that as a kid. Like I was always interested in like ghost things. I loved Adam's Family, and not just because it was this very like gothic style show. It was like the other beings in it. They were so different. Like you had Lurch, who was like Frankenstein, and cousin It was completely covered in hair, some kind of like hair creature, and then Hans with the hand, and like that stuff was interesting to me. Things that were other than human have always been interesting to me, but that exorcism stuff with all the people yelling and then me feeling the terror of another person in a way that I had never experienced before, because that was a very strong emotion to feel. And that it scared me. It scared the fuck out of me. And it just made me realize like a lot of the fear that I've ever had didn't come from actual fear. It came from like a lot of outside sources. And then I was thinking about how, like, also as a kid, from that instance too, as a kid, I had a lot of nightmares. I had an uncanny amount of nightmares, and I was always being chased, or I also had dreams of being like assaulted, but a lot of that was stemming from like the abuse that I had already suffered. And so I was being chased by like what humans consider like demons or whatever. It was other creatures. It was other creatures that kind of looked like, some of them I can't really describe. Like, and some of them look like what horror movies and other things depict as like wendigos. But there are things that kind of look like the horror movie depictions of wendigos, that they're not evil, and I have talked to them before. And so I don't want to give the impression that everything that looks like that is bad. But I used to run a lot from these like demon dog looking creatures. They didn't really look like dogs. They just were on all fours and had potentially from a distance the appearance of being a dog, but their head was nowhere near the dog shape. I can't fully explain, but I just call them demon dogs. But I've seen a lot of creatures, and I used to run from a lot of them. And I think it was really about my teenage years that I stopped actually running, because I was so angry because I had gone through this for so long, and I always knew something was wrong with me. And even to this fucking day I feel like that, but I always like felt something was wrong with me, because I always felt like everybody was telling me to do all of this stuff, and I felt like I just couldn't, but I was being forced to, so I really didn't have a choice, but it felt like it was ripping me apart, and I couldn't explain it. I couldn't articulate it in any way. And if I tried to like say, hey, this is too much for me. All of it is too much. Like breathing is too much. It's like I have to force, like my existence is feels like I have to force my heart to continue to beat, because if I don't, then I will cease to be. And I've always felt like that my whole life, and I couldn't explain that. So all I could say is that it's too much. And because I didn't have bills and because my life was completely controlled by somebody else, then what's too much? The only thing you need to worry about is your schoolwork and cleaning up after yourself, which really it wasn't cleaning up after myself, it was cleaning up after everybody. And so with all of that piled on, then I had to figure out what I wanted to do with my whole life. And I never knew. And that also created fear, because it's just like I'm scared because I'm about to be pushed out into the fucking world with no experience and no sense of direction, because I don't know what's wrong with me. I know something's wrong with me. I don't know what, and I can't seem to get help from anyone. And everything that I wanted to do, I was told I couldn't, because I would have chosen to do, I would have chosen to sing, I would have chosen to dance, I would have chosen to paint, to do art, because that's all I ever really cared about. That and learning other languages, which I was actually really good at. And it was just crazy. So I would actually create these like fear scenarios in my mind, because that's how I was convinced out of doing these things. Oh, you can't do that because they never make it on their own, and that's on your own is the only way to prosper, and all of that shit. It was just like, it was always something. Like always something convincing me out of it. So I like kind of internalized and created fear around it, which, led to the anger. And eventually, when I hit the teenage years, I stopped being afraid of the things chasing me and started facing them, because I was like, you know what? I don't even want to be here anymore, because like that's the mentality that I had when I hit teenage years. Actually, before that, but that's when it really set in. Like, I can't do what I want, so there's no point in me being here. And so I stopped running. I stopped running, and I was like, you know what? Do your fucking worst at this point. And I started fighting back. In some cases, I would fight whatever beings were chasing after me, and in other cases, I would just talk to them, because in some cases they were just me. They were aspects of myself I was running from, the parts of me that I kept having to push away and shed, because it was not okay to be this person and still live with my family. But I was underage. I couldn't go anywhere. I didn't have anything. I didn't have any sense of self. And I was also being asked to freaking choose what my path would be for the rest of my freaking life at the same time. And I was just like, bro, I can't even choose whether or not I eat at this point, because it's all dependent upon what we have. Like, I guess I could make requests or whatever, and every now and then they would be heard, but most of the time, a lot of the choices that were made for me, even if like I asked, because I did ask at one point to get a pet, and then I didn't even get to pick which pet we got, and that happened every time I asked to get a pet. Like, I never got to pick which pet, because there was always some like excuse. Oh, black cats are considered evil, and with the superstitious and blah, 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 stuff like that. But yeah, eventually, I guess I'll just like do a part two, because there's like a little bit more to go with this. So part two next. I'm not about to squeeze it in.